Too much and never enough. How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man by Mary L. Trump. Picture this. You're heading to a family dinner, but instead of your aunt's cozy dining room, a White House van pulls up to your door. Your destination? 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. You're about to share a meal in the executive residence with your uncle, who just happens to be the President of the United States. Sounds like a fantasy, right? But for Mary L. Trump, this was her reality on April 4, 2017. She found herself gliding through the legendary halls of the White House, passing portraits of former First Ladies, on her way to celebrate her aunt's birthdays. The whole experience felt dreamlike. The glittering chandeliers, the perfectly manicured rose garden, the hushed elegance surrounding her. And then, almost unexpectedly, she was standing outside the Oval Office, gazing at her uncle, Donald Trump, seated behind the famous Resolute desk as the most powerful person on the planet. But something about the scene stopped her cold. Her uncle sat while congresspeople and senators stood around him like courtiers, attending a monarch. It was a power move she'd witnessed countless times before. The exact same way her grandfather, Fred Trump, used to command his office in Queens, forcing everyone to come to him, keeping them on their feet while he remained seated, silently broadcasting who held all the cards. In that single instant, Mary saw the connection between past and present, a family's private dysfunction now playing out on the world's most public stage. This is the heart of Too Much and Never Enough. Mary Trump isn't simply a bitter relative with an axe to grind. She's a clinical psychologist with a doctorate, trained to decode the complex patterns of human behavior, trauma, and family dysfunction. She claims to be the only Trump willing and able to reveal how her family shaped the man who would eventually sit in the Oval Office. This book tackles a question the world has been wrestling with. Why is he the way he is? Her answer isn't rooted in politics, it's psychological. It's a journey backward in time, into an imposing house in Queens, where two brothers grew up beneath the shadow of a powerful, emotionally distant father. It's about what happens when a child's hunger for love meets only coldness, when showing empathy is treated as weakness, and when money becomes the sole measure of human value. Today we're going to walk through that story together. And I promise you, by the end, you'll understand not just the man, but the powerful, often invisible forces of family that shape every one of us. You'll see how the dynamics within a single household can ripple outward, eventually touching every corner of the globe. This isn't just a biography, it's a masterclass in human psychology. Let's dive in. To truly understand Donald Trump, you can't begin with Donald. You can't even start with his father, Fred. You have to start with a feeling, a gnawing sense of scarcity, even when you're drowning in wealth. A feeling that you never have enough, even when you have too much. This feeling was the invisible air the Trump children breathed. And it all flowed from one source, Fred Trump, Sr. Fred wasn't simply a successful real estate developer from Queens. Mary Trump describes him as a high-functioning sociopath. Now that's a loaded term, but what she means is a man who lacked the essential building blocks of human connection. Empathy, kindness, the ability to see his children as people with their own needs and feelings. These concepts were completely foreign to Fred. To Fred, children weren't meant to be nurtured. They were meant to be useful. They were extensions of his ambition. He didn't offer love, he demanded obedience. His affection, if you could even call it that, came with strings attached. It had to be earned, and the only currency he accepted was becoming what he wanted. A killer. Tough, ruthless, and entirely self-reliant. Fred saw the world as a zero-sum game. One winner, everyone else a loser. Giving something to another person meant you had less. kindness equaled weakness. Apologizing was the ultimate sin. This was Fred's gospel. Now imagine growing up as a small child in this environment. It would be tough for anyone. But for the Trump children, things were about to take a turn for the worse. When Donald was just 2.5 years old, his mother, Mary, faced a severe medical crisis after giving birth to her youngest son, Robert. Complications led to an emergency hysterectomy and a cascade of infections that kept her hospitalized for nearly a year. During a critical window of Donald's early development, his mother essentially disappeared. For any child, this is devastating trauma. Your primary source of comfort, security, and love simply vanishes. It creates a terrifying emptiness. In a healthy family, another caregiver steps in to fill that void, offering comfort and reassurance. But this was Fred Trump's house. Fred believed dealing with young children wasn't his responsibility. He maintained his punishing work schedule, leaving his 5 children effectively motherless. When his young sons Donald and Robert cried out for their mother in distress, they weren't met with comforting hugs. They were met with their father's irritation and indifference. Think about the lesson this teaches a child. Your needs are a burden. Your feelings are irrelevant. Showing vulnerability, needing something from someone, isn't just pointless, it's dangerous. It triggers anger, not comfort. So Donald, at the tender age of 2, learned to survive. He began constructing a wall around himself. He developed what Mary, the psychologist, calls powerful but primitive defenses. He buried his feelings of fear and abandonment so deep he could pretend they didn't exist. He learned that being needy only led to humiliation. In place of those buried emotions, something else emerged, a shell of toughness, aggressiveness, disrespect, a tendency to bully. He became loud and difficult, and this is when his father, Fred, finally started paying attention. But Fred didn't see a wounded little boy who needed help. He saw the early signs of a killer. He saw the toughness he'd always craved in a son. So instead of correcting these behaviors, he encouraged them. He validated them. He championed the very qualities that made Donald, as Mary puts it, essentially unlovable. This is the heartbreaking paradox at the core of this story. Fred Trump created the wound in his son's soul, and then rewarded him for developing the most toxic ways of coping with that wound. But Donald wasn't the only son. There was another, older brother, and what happened to him would become the defining lesson of Donald's life. His name was Frederick Christ Trump Jr., but everyone called him Freddie. Freddie was the firstborn son, the namesake, the heir apparent. The entire weight of Fred Sr.'s expectations settled on his shoulders. He was supposed to take over the Trump empire and carry the family name forward. But there was a problem. Freddie wasn't a killer. He was handsome, fun-loving, and genuinely kind. His friends loved him. He enjoyed boating, fishing, and cracking jokes. He had a natural sense of humor and a deep sensitivity, all the qualities his father couldn't stand. Fred saw this gentleness not as humanity, but as weakness, the greatest sin imaginable. So from Freddie's earliest years, Fred launched a relentless campaign to tear his oldest son down. He ridiculed Freddie's interests. When Freddie wanted to get a pet, Fred called it stupid. When Freddie made a mistake and apologized, Fred would mock him, sneering, "Sorry, Dad." Every aspect of Freddie's personality was devalued and destroyed. Imagine the psychological torture of this existence. The person whose approval you desperately crave is telling you, day after day, that who you are is fundamentally wrong. Freddie lived in a system of all punishment and no reward. He was told he had to achieve unqualified success, while simultaneously being told he could never measure up. Now Donald, 7.5 years younger, had front-row seats to this brutal performance. He watched his father humiliate his older brother. He witnessed Freddie's shame, and he absorbed a simple, brutal lesson: do not be like Freddie. If his father didn't respect Freddie, then Donald wouldn't either. If his father thought Freddie was weak, then Donald would be strong. Donald began systematically eliminating any quality he might share with his brother. He doubled down on the bullying, the arrogance, the refusal to ever back down or apologize. One of the most revealing stories from their childhood is the infamous mashed potato incident. One evening at dinner, 7-year-old Donald was relentlessly tormenting his younger brother Robert. No one could get him to stop. He treated his mother with contempt and ignored her pleas. Finally, Freddie, 14 at the time, had enough. In a moment of pure frustration, he grabbed the bowl of mashed potatoes and dumped it on Donald's head. Everyone at the table burst into laughter. They were laughing at Donald. For the first time in his life, someone he considered beneath him had publicly humiliated him. Mary writes that this moment wounded Donald's pride so deeply that he was still visibly angry when Mary Ann mentioned it at the White House dinner decades later. It was a searing lesson. Humiliation was a weapon, and from that day forward he would always be the one wielding it, never the one on the receiving end. As the boys grew older, their paths diverged exactly as you'd expect. Freddie, trying to carve out some space for himself, went off to college and discovered a passion: flying. He loved the freedom, the discipline, the clear rules of aviation. You log the hours, pass the tests, earn the license. It was the opposite of life with his father, where the rules were unspoken and success was never acknowledged. After graduating, Freddie tried to do what was expected. He joined Trump management to work for his father. But the grim reality of the job, combined with Fred's constant belittling, was crushing him. One day, he made what seemed like a sensible executive decision, ordering new windows for a building. Fred was furious. In front of all the employees, he screamed at Freddie, "You should have slapped a coat of paint on them instead of wasting my money. Donald is worth 10 of you." At the time, Donald was still in high school. That was the breaking point. Freddie realized he had to escape. He told his wife, Linda, that he was applying to become a commercial pilot for TWA. It was a courageous move. For a brief, shining moment, he was his own man. He was accepted into the training program and became a professional pilot, flying the coveted Boston to Los Angeles route. Mary points out that this was an incredible achievement, something none of Fred's other children ever accomplished, building a career entirely on their own merit. But Fred saw it as the ultimate betrayal. A bus driver in the sky was how he contemptuously described his son's profession. He couldn't stand that Freddie had chosen a life outside his control. The pressure never let up. Phone calls, letters, a constant stream of abuse from his father. Then came the final blow. Fred sent Donald and Robert up to visit Freddie in Marblehead, Massachusetts, where he was living with his young family. Mary describes this not as a friendly visit, but as a mission. Donald was there to deliver their father's message in person. Over dinner, Donald started in on his older brother. "Dad's right about you," he said, weaponizing Fred's words. "You're nothing but a glorified bus driver." Hearing those words, his father's contempt, spoken in his little brother's voice, shattered Freddie's spirit. His drinking, which had started as a coping mechanism, spiraled dramatically. Within months, TWA gave him an ultimatum: resign or be fired for his alcohol problem. His flying career, which had lasted less than a year, was over. He had lost everything. Defeated, he returned to New York and asked his father for a job. Fred reluctantly agreed, making it clear it was a favor. With Freddie's apparent failure, Donald saw his opening. He had already gotten into the prestigious Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, not through academic merit, but through favors and cheating. Mary alleges that Donald, worried his grades weren't good enough, paid a smart friend to take his SATs for him. He then had Freddie call in a favor with a friend who worked in Penn's admissions office. When Donald graduated and joined Trump management, his father rolled out the red carpet. While Freddie had been given mundane tasks and constant criticism, Donald was immediately named vice president of several companies, given consulting fees for projects he didn't work on, and showered with praise. In 1971, Fred officially promoted the 24-year-old Donald to president of Trump Management, a position his 33-year-old brother, who had been with the company for over a decade, had never been granted. This promotion wasn't a business decision, it was a punishment. It was Fred's final public humiliation of his firstborn son. This is how Donald learned the rules of the world. He learned that being himself, being sensitive, or pursuing your own passions led to destruction. He learned that what his father valued was a projection of strength, no matter how hollow, and a willingness to be a tool for his ambitions. So Donald became that tool. Fred had long dreamed of expanding his real estate empire from the outer boroughs into the glitz and glamour of Manhattan, but he lacked the polish and social skills to pull it off himself. Donald, however, had the audacity. He had the brazenness and hunger for the spotlight that Fred secretly envied. So began the creation of the Donald Trump brand. It was a joint venture. Fred provided the money, the connections, and the expertise behind the scenes. Donald played the role of the brilliant, self-made dealmaker in the spotlight. When Donald first ventured into Manhattan to transform the old Commodore Hotel into the Grand Hyatt, it was Fred's political connections with Mayor Abe Beame that secured a staggering 40-year tax abatement, a massive government handout that made the project possible. The media, however, printed Donald's version, that he had accomplished it all single-handedly. This became the blueprint for everything that followed. The family, the media, and later the banks all became enablers in perpetuating the myth. They started the process of normalizing him. His brashness was framed as confidence, not arrogance. His lies were seen as clever marketing. His refusal to pay contractors was just tough business. Mary writes that her grandfather knew Donald was incompetent as a day-to-day businessman. He knew Donald had no attention to detail, but he was willing to stake millions on his son because he could leverage Donald's real talents: self-promotion, shamelessness, and brand building. Any story about Donald's success was really a story about Fred's power and money. But this arrangement had a dangerous side effect. Donald was completely insulated from the consequences of his actions. He was, in a sense, always institutionalized. From his father's house to military school to his father's company, and later the White House, he was never forced to survive on his own in the real world. This became terrifyingly clear when he moved into Atlantic City. Fred thought casinos were a terrible investment and warned Donald against them. But Donald, now believing his own mythology, plunged ahead. He bought one casino, then another, then a third, the Taj Mahal, racking up billions in debt. He didn't understand that running a casino was vastly different from his father's business of collecting rent in Brooklyn. His casinos were competing with each other, eating away at their own profits. Soon the house of cards began to collapse. In 1990, Donald missed a massive payment for Trump's castle. He was teetering on the edge of personal and corporate bankruptcy. So, what did his father do? In a desperate and illegal move, Fred sent his chauffeur to the castle to buy over $3 million worth of casino chips with no intention of gambling. It was a phony last-minute loan to help Donald make his debt payment. It was the ultimate bailout, and it cemented in Donald's mind the core belief that has guided his entire life. No matter how badly he fails, someone will always be there to save him. The rules don't apply to him. He can never truly lose. Knowing you'll be rescued makes the concept of failure meaningless. You can just declare it a victory, and for you, it is. While Donald was failing upward, Freddie was spiraling downward. He never recovered from losing his dream and his father's respect. He moved back to New York and, after his marriage to Linda ended, lived alone in a series of depressing apartments, his health destroyed by alcoholism. Mary tells a heartbreaking story of visiting him in his final years. He was living back at his parents' house, but not in his old bedroom. He was living in a small, cramped room they called the cell, or sometimes in the attic on a cot. He was a ghost, haunting his own childhood home. In September 1981, at just 42 years old, Freddie had a fatal heart attack, brought on by years of heavy drinking. He died alone in a Queens hospital. No one from the family was with him. While his brother lay dying, Donald went to the movies. His death was the tragic, inevitable result of Fred's cruelty. But for the family, it was merely an inconvenience. At the wake, Mary, then 16, begged her uncles to honor her father's wish to have his ashes scattered at sea off Montauk, the place he loved most. Her grandfather refused. He associated Montauk with Freddie's frivolous hobbies, the things that had distracted him from the serious business of real estate. Instead, they buried his ashes in the family plot. Even in death, Freddie was denied his final wish. The final act of this family drama came after Fred Trump died in 1999. When his will was read, Mary and her brother Fritz discovered they had been almost entirely cut out. Their father's share of the massive estate, which should have passed to them, was instead divided among Fred's 4 living children. Their entire branch of the family had been erased, as if their father had never existed. When they decided to contest the will, the family's reaction was swift and brutal. They immediately cut off the medical insurance that Mary's brother relied on to cover the crushing medical costs for his infant son William, who suffered from severe seizures. In depositions, Mary Ann called her niece and nephew absentee grandchildren. Robert told them their grandfather didn't give a damn about them. And their grandmother, in a final, cold phone call, told them their father had been worth a whole lot of nothing when he died. In this family, where money was the only currency, it became the only way to measure a person's worth. Freddie had died without money, so his life and the lives of his children meant nothing. They were a family that had too much, but for whom nothing was ever enough. And that, Mary argues, is the psychological blueprint that was exported from that house in Queens, first to New York City and then to the White House. It's a world where empathy is a fatal flaw, where truth is whatever you can get away with, and where cruelty isn't a bug in the system. It's the whole point. As we step back from this powerful and, honestly, deeply disturbing story, it's easy to get caught up in the headlines and famous names. But if we do that, we miss the profound human lesson Mary Trump is offering us. This book isn't just about a president. It's a case study in how a family can shape a person's entire reality. The most powerful lesson here is about the devastating consequences of conditional love. Fred Trump created a world where his children had to compete for his approval, and that approval was only given to the child who best mirrored his own ruthless, transactional worldview. Freddie, the sensitive son, was destroyed by this system. Donald, the survivor, learned that to win his father's love, he had to kill off parts of himself, his empathy, his vulnerability, his capacity for real human connection. He became a performance. What does this teach us? Especially when we're young and figuring out who we are, it teaches us the importance of unconditional worth. Your value as a person isn't tied to your achievements, how much money you make, or whether you fit someone else's idea of a killer. Your worth is intrinsic. It's just there. A family that understands this builds people up. A family that doesn't, like the Trumps, breaks them, even while showering them with gold. The second key takeaway is the danger of being shielded from reality. Donald Trump, as his niece explains, has been institutionalized his entire life. He was never allowed to fail and learn from it. His father, and then the banks, and then the media, always bailed him out. This creates a person who's incapable of taking responsibility, because in his world, he's never had to. He doesn't learn from mistakes. He just spins them as successes. For anyone listening who's ambitious and wants to build something meaningful in the world, this is a critical warning. True strength isn't about never failing. It's about how you respond to failure. It's about owning your mistakes, learning from them, and developing the resilience that only comes from facing real-world consequences. A life without consequences isn't a life of power. It's a life lived in a gilded cage, and it creates a profound and dangerous weakness. So what can we do with this story? First, we can look at our own lives with a bit more compassion. We can understand that the dynamics in our own families, the spoken and unspoken rules, have a powerful effect on us. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward deciding which ones we want to carry forward and which ones we want to leave behind. Second, we can consciously choose to cultivate the very things that were punished in the Trump household: empathy, kindness, and vulnerability. We can recognize that these aren't weaknesses, but the foundations of true strength and meaningful connection. They're the things that make us human. This book is a dark journey, there's no doubt about it, but sometimes it's by studying the darkness that we come to appreciate the light. It shows us the kind of person we don't want to be, and in doing so clarifies the kind of person we do want to become. That was a summary of Too Much and Never Enough by Mary L. Trump. We've explored the main currents of this incredible story today, but, honestly, a summary can only take you so far. The real power is in the details, the quiet moments, the specific conversations, the psychological insights that hit you in ways you didn't expect. This summary is designed to give you a map of the territory. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I genuinely encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see the hidden forces that shape all of our lives. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets us know we're on the right track, and it ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.